Hello, I'm Brenda Howard, and this is Applied Occupational Theory, and we are discussing the Kawa or river model today. Now, this is an emerging model in occupational therapy, and so we're going to be discussing how this model came about, why was it needed, what is its emphasis, and how can we go about using it in occupational therapy. So Kawa does mean river in Japanese, and this was developed by Iwama and Lim. The first article that I found was 2006, although I believe it was actually developed before that. And Michael Iwama in particular is the main author, and he is a Japanese Canadian. And the model's purpose was for cultural relevance because they were finding that the typical person first models were not fitting with Eastern ways of thinking in particular, as far as being culturally sensitive. So the whole need for this model was to address diverse clientele and to look at the interconnectedness rather than focusing on person as the center of everything, but to look at how things are interconnected in the environment and according to this model with nature, with deity, with persons in all of the life experience. In this model, the idea of internal and external doesn't exist. So it's a very different way of thinking. And rather than using some sort of a visual model that's depicting how the different aspects of the theory interact, it's using a metaphor, in this case, a river, rather than some sort of say, like a systems theory type of presentation. The purpose or the focus of this particular model is all about enabling or enhancing life's flow by enhancing the harmony between all the elements that are forming the overall context, including the individual, which is embedded and inseparable from the context. So I have for you a few slides that I actually received from Michael Iwama. He wants his model to be open access, so he provided these to me and to others at a workshop in 2016. And the idea of the model in his mind was to boil down the essence of occupational therapy to how people interact with the environment around them, and also to use models in culturally safe ways. This model actually came about because Michael Iwama was doing a model of human occupation workshop in Japan, and presenting it in the Japanese language, and there were so many people there that were like, we get the idea of occupation, we get the idea of the need to help people connect with the things that they want to be able to do, but this theoretical perspective that puts the person at the center of this system doesn't make sense to us at all. And so he got to thinking about, could there be a different approach, a culturally sensitive approach to presenting occupational therapy to other people. Uh, and he talks about, as far as the goal of occupational therapy, instead of calling it a goal, he calls it occupational therapy's magnificent promise, which is to enable people from all streams of life to engage and participate in activities and processes of daily living that matter. Now, in order to understand this model, we need to understand the East Asian variation of the cosmological myth. So the cosmological myth is, how do we explain basically our existence? It sort of comes from a religious and a philosophical approach to things. So in the East Asian way of looking at things, nature, deities, and humans are all part of this inseparable whole. We all live together within this environment, and there's no way to separate out nature from an individual, from a deity in this particular way of thinking. Now, this is very different from our Western way of viewing things, where we look at this cosmological myth as split out into a variety of aspects. So, and we also look at it in a hierarchical way. We look at God or truth being the ultimate and on top of the pyramid. Next comes the self. Next comes others within the environment, so people first. And then after that, subservient to the self and society, is nature and the environment. And these are viewed in the Western world as being separate from each other, not as a unique whole. Well, within the approach that the Kawa model takes, it takes a very social constructivist approach, that the self is socially constructed and the self doesn't exist outside of the meaning that's created by the groups of people together. This means that the self is not central or not unilaterally empowered. The self is simply part of the whole. This also changes the idea of occupation, that one doesn't need to occupy or control anything because the person is part of the group. So being one with the group or part of the milieu or the cosmos is very important within this Eastern way of thinking. One of the things that we don't think about in the Western world is how our conceptual models are very situated in culture, because it's difficult to see your own culture um, unless you are comparing and contrasting it with another culture. So we have to think that our own culture may not be relevant to all persons. In our Western culture, the self is very much centralized, and that comes out in our occupation-based model as well. That client-centered, or a model where the person is at the center, is very important. Or this sense of entitlement, this top-down way of thinking about occupations, is not part of the Eastern way of thinking at all. In Eastern culture, the self is decentralized, and autonomy and individualism and occupational participation are not the primary goals in those settings. Rather, well-being means interconnectedness and harmony. So people find value and importance in a sense of self only when embedded in relationships, only when connected to others, environment, and deity. So the place and the context are very important in looking at the meanings, the form, the functions of human occupation. Now, Michael Iwama first represented this through this model that had these arrows going in all these different directions. He was trying to pattern this after Western ways of thinking, where you had to have a linear model with arrows pointing to and fro. And he was finding that it just did not work for him when it came to try and explain the model. So instead, he came up with the river metaphor. Take a moment and think about comparing and contrasting the different ways that your typical occupation-based model approaches the person, the environment, the occupation, and obstacles to occupational performance, and the way the Kawa model would approach this. So in an OBM, we would think of a person as being central, whereas in the Kawa model, the person is very decentralized, for example. So take some time to think through what are some of the ways that these things can be similar, but also what are some of the differences between Kawa and other occupation-based models. Maybe pick one that you're familiar with and break it down. So let's talk about some of the aspects of this model a little bit more. Kawa means river, and this does have a very lifespan approach. So upstream is going to be the past, all the way back to birth, and downstream is the future, all the way to death. Mizu is the water, which represents the life's essence or flow. And we have two other very important aspects, which is the riverside wall and bottoms, which are the environment or the context. Now, ba is a specific word meaning social context, which is most important and central to the person. We also have physical context. Now, in this particular river model with the cross section, a wide flowing river shows health and good relationships. Function in this context is when there is harmony in life experiences between the self and the context, and there's a state of well-being with unimpeded flow. In this case, the person is embedded in their relationships, and it's not about independence, but belonging and interdependence. Harmony is the point of reference here. And in this case, there's not one rigid explanation of what is function, but it's unique to each individual. Now let's talk about what are some of the obstacles to that life flow. First, we have Iwa, which is rocks, and Ryuboku, which is driftwood. So the rocks are impediments to life's flow, and they can be anything that are keeping the person from contact with their social context. Now, this could be the disability or dysfunction that the person is facing, but it could also be someone in their environment or something in their environment that they see as an obstacle. Anything that impedes their life's flow. Now, driftwood is simply attributes and resources. These can be positive and helpful, or they can also be negative and obstructive. These can include things like what is the person's values, what is their character, what's their personality, what are some of the skills they bring to the table, what's their immaterial and material wealth. Maybe they have immaterial wealth in terms of a vast resource of family and friends who are willing to help them out. But the picture is showing how with the rocks and the driftwood, it can obstruct or cause sediment to the river sides and bottom, which is restricting the person's ability to be in contact with their context, and in particular, their social context. So disability are these discrete circumstances that can impede life's flow. And they are compounding the overall impediment to the life's flow with these specific problems. So it's a rich combination of both internal and external circumstances and structures in a life's flow that are inextricably determining his or her life's flow. So what this is saying is that disability or the impediment to life's flow can be a result of a specific circumstance, but that's not the only thing that's going on. So it's a much more global view of the person's life. Rather than looking at just this disability episode, it's looking at the entire context of their lives and other things that the person may be seeing as impediments as well. So the goal of occupational therapy is to make space between the rocks, is this tsukima. So occupational therapy's role is to assist the client in making these spaces between the rocks and removing the obstructions as able in order to increase the life's flow and to put the person back in contact with their environment. So we're back to that promise of occupational therapy, which is to make the spaces in which the person can move and live and reconnect with the loved ones in order to maximize their flow. So what is change and motivation then within this occupation-based model? Well, change is making space for life's flow, and the motivation is more about the harmony, the balance, the connectedness. So we can't say, is it intrinsic or extrinsic? Because in this model, there is no intrinsic and extrinsic. It's both. It's the harmony. It's the balance. And that's what the motivation is within this particular model. So how do we assess or evaluate the person? And actually, this is a very psychodynamic approach. We're actually going to use the river metaphor to draw out the client's narrative of their day-to-day living experiences. What do they see as rocks and obstacles? What do they see as driftwood and resources and advantages to them? What is their social context? So this is not dependent on a particular measurement tool. It's simply looking for what are the attributes, the resources, and the obstructions. And then from there, the therapist can select more tools to expand on finding out more about those attributes, resources, and obstructions. So if it's a biomechanical approach, we might be doing manual muscle test and range of motion after we find out what this person's narrative is. So it's a very narrative approach. With intervention, the guideline that we're given is that we are simply making spaces for life's flow. Each person and their inseparable context hold latent potential for healing. So that's a huge belief of this model, that everyone has capacity for healing. And that if we work with that person to remove the obstructions and to seek that harmony, balance, and interconnectedness, we can get to that place of health with them. So with the Kawa model, this is where you get to consider your own case study. So we've got Mr. Miller, And I'm not going to read you about Mr. Miller right now. So for those in my class right now, you're going to be using the Google form to complete this case study individually. And I have the narrative written out in the Google form in lessons, and you can take a look at that to learn about Mr. Miller's life and how we would be focusing on increasing his life's flow. Now, what we would do as we consider intervention, we're going to be thinking about breaking the rocks. Well, what does that mean? Breaking the rocks means whatever it takes to remove the obstacles for this person. We're going to maximize the spaces, and that means promoting their strengths, their interests, and their skills. We're going to utilize the driftwood. What are the aspects that they have, the attributes that are helpful to them? And we're going to enhance those. And we're going to widen the river walls and bed. In other words, look at how can we improve the context in order to mobilize this person to being more engaged and in harmony with their environment. So it might be their friends, the interdisciplinary team, their physical context, any number of things that we would be focusing on in that aspect. So take a look at that case study, and thank you for participating with me.